Ever thought to yourself, what if everything in life is meaningless? Actually, don't do that. It's really unhealthy for anyone to think about that kind of stuff, especially us Gacha gamers, that believe in our heart of hearts that every pull we do will lead us towards greater glory. Unless every pull is meaningless. Oh geez. Anyways, you know who did think about this stuff so that we don't have to, and is probably the narrative reason for why we even get to play Epic 7 in the first place? That's right, our old buddy Vildred. So let's take a look into his lore, trudge up as many details as possible, and explore Vildred's unfortunate, or possibly fortunate, run-in with the philosophy of nihilism. So, ever since I've gone back and read through episode 1 and the original side stories, I've had an opportunity to ask deeper questions about the lore that I never thought about going through the first time. This is why I started a new account, so that I could be informed about any changes that have been made, as well as highlight any details that I might have missed along the way. Because, to be honest, if you read through the entire story through the first time along, how long would it have taken you to get to the endgame? No thanks. I told myself I'd get to the endgame and then go back and rerun the story. And now, 2 episodes later, I finally find myself remembering that I would do this. I'm going to assume that there are many of you out there that also may have planned to go back and reread the story, but just, well, didn't. Instead, we relied on Reddit posts to inform us about the overall story, which undoubtedly has caused us to miss the fine details that truly make this story, in my opinion, one of the most enjoyable to experience. Seriously, reading Ras and Arky just pulverizing each other with friendly insults is reason enough to go back and experience the story in its entirety. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about Vildred. Vildred is arguably the most important character in episode 1, not simply because he occupies the main antagonist role, but because he is both the reason for why we have a narrative in this game to begin with, and I also argue that he is the main reason, not Ras, for why we are able to release ourselves from the endless Archdemon wars. In the end, Vildred sent us on the right path. In the end, Vildred's actions save us all. #Vildred did nothing wrong. Vildred is the general of the Ezran army. I'm not entirely sure if that means he commanded all 4 arms of the army, or if he's part of one of them, but if I were to harbor a guess, I would put him in charge of all of them, so when he inevitably betrays us, the role of the general is given over to Charles. Vildred is also considered to be Ras's greatest champion, and this is in reference to his part to play in the last 6 worlds. Now, we don't know what happened exactly during those worlds, where Ras and his heirs were able to defeat the Archdemon, whether Ras was able to give the people of Britannia a reason for why the Archdemon would keep coming back, or if he just kept them in the dark, but it is Vildred's actions in the 6th world that matter the most. On an aside, I'm going to posit a little theory here that Britannia was always doomed to lose to the Archdemon, because even if they defeated the Archdemon, any heirs that died probably would not have come back, and I doubt DJ would have nominated another one to help with the next Archdemon. DJ is kind of a dick that way. So all Charon and the other acolytes would have had to do is focus down the heirs, and the next Archdemon would have eventually won due to the heirs not being replenished. Does this make sense? It really makes you wonder if DJ actually thought this plan through at all. Alright, moving on. Vildred's backstory prominently takes place over several side stories, as well as the main story. In chronological order, you can read through his past leading into the main narrative from the 6th World prologue, going into Eulogy for a Saint, then going into Vildred's side story, One Sword, One Truth, and finally, all of Episode 1. And although he does appear in other stories, they are pretty inconsequential to his character arc. It all begins in the 6th world, where Ras, Vildred, Ruel, and Kisei are racing towards the sanctuary in order to regain their strength so that they can engage Archdemon Angrath. Too bad they didn't have the healer girl on hand, right? Along the way, they are ambushed by minions of the Archdemon, and Vildred tells his friends that he will buy them some time because they are more important than he is. He specifically states that he is only human, which reveals how much the heir of the Covenant and his heirs are revered by him and the rest of the citizens of Orbis. To their reluctance, they leave Vildred behind, but urge him to catch up with them later. While battling the Archdemon's minions, Vildred is encountered by an acolyte, Cheiron, who implants a piece of the Archdemon's might into him before killing him. Ouch. This will be incredibly important later. After the world reset, Vildred is back as the general of the Ezran army during the events of the Eulogy for a Saint's side story. This is where a holy saint, Diene, fails to complete her duty as a saint due to her fragility, but is able to convince the Nocturnes with the help of her bodyguard Bast and the Tyrannor king, Friedrich, to seal the Archdemon away, at least until the heir of the Covenant awakens. The importance of this side story is not necessarily the events that transpire, but the idea that Vildred at this point in time would probably be experiencing the hallucinatory effects of the Archdemon's might implanted in him by Cheiron from the previous world. Nevertheless, he commands the Ezran army to engage the Archdemon's minions in order to buy Diene and the Nocturnes enough time to complete the sealing. Interestingly, he acts like an older brother to Bask, possibly his last noble endeavor before he is thrust into the twisted wiles of the Acolyte of Death. Years later, with relative peace returning to the world after the Archdemon's sealing, we find an uneasy Vildred, having been tortured by visions from Cheiron leaking tiny morsels of truth from the Archdemon War. Eventually, he sets off in order to uncover the truth after having exhausted his resources both at the castle and external. Vildred eventually finds himself at the Breezy Plains, just south of the Ezran Kingdom, where Cheiron continues to send visions of himself, taunting him, to continue his quest to discover the truth for himself. As he ascends to the top of a ruined stronghold, Cheiron finally confronts him, bombarding his mind with more visions, this time regarding an event that Vildred is not sure of. In the vision, Vildred sees himself fighting alongside an individual that he has never met before, Aki, one of the heirs from an earlier world. He watches himself struggle with Aki's decision to sacrifice himself in order to give Ras and Vildred of that world time, similar to what he did during the Sixth World's destruction. He also overhears Ras speaking with Aki about matters concerning how he does not want to see the world destroyed again. Vildred questions if Cheiron is simply showing him nonsense, and Cheiron utters that everything he is seeing is of a world that now never existed, and that the goddess and Ras are just using humans to fight a war that is inevitably meaningless. Vildred thinks back as memories of the Sixth World flood into him, regarding him and Ras, discussing how Ras must feel as the heir of the Covenant, and he notices how Ras is quite dismissive of his questions, or never truly answers anything. Everything is so shrouded in mystery. And to Vildred's defense, Ras really does not play his cards very well during these exchanges. Why would you say anything if you were in Ras's position? If my theory earlier about Britannia pretty much being doomed all along is true, then why would Ras bother to say anything that would make his job harder? Especially since at this point in time, he has had no motivation to understand humans, and says as much during episode 1. With this seed firmly planted, Vildred returns to Ezra and continues with his normal duties while plotting his eventual betrayal, most likely researching where all of the Archdemon's mights are. I also can't imagine he isn't talking to Cheiron from time to time to really hash out their plan. But this presents an interesting question. Why didn't Vildred just collect the Archdemon's mights right away before Ras awakens? This is most likely because Ras is the last piece of the puzzle for Vildred to decide if forsaking the goddess is the right thing to do. So when Ras asks himself what might have happened if he had answered Vildred differently, he is recognizing that his answer was the straw that broke the camel's back. Ironically, the answer that Ras eventually discovers is similar in outcome with Vildred's, furthering the idea that Vildred was right all along. After Ras awakens, Vildred asks his burning question, seizes control over the first Archdemon's might, becomes the Arbiter, and then sets off to collect the others. Over the course of the game, Vildred and Kayron manipulate other characters into getting in Rass's way, as well as collecting the Archdemon's mites in order to resurrect the Archdemon fully. Unfortunately, Rass is able to purify half of them, and thus I believe the Archdemon is resurrected through Mercedes at partial strength, possibly explaining why we are able to defeat her so easily. At the same time, Rass is also empowered by the mites purified into the fragments of Illyrios, making him more powerful also. Just as Rass is explaining to Vildred what he discovered from the World Tree, Vildred is impaled from behind by a mind-controlled Mercedes, who absorbs the Archdemon's mites from within him and partially manifests as Archdemon Mercedes. I believe that Vildred was on the path to agreeing with Rass, should he have been given enough time to process what Rass was telling him. In the end, Vildred was sacrificed in order for Rass to be put into a situation that forced him to understand the people that he was protecting. Before Vildred's betrayal, Rass was trying to protect Orbis, the land. Now, he was focused on protecting the people of Orbis, which inevitably led him to the World Tree. So, Vildred seems to struggle with a philosophy known as nihilism. What is nihilism, you may be asking? Nihilism is the belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. A true nihilist would believe in nothing, have no loyalties, and no purpose other than perhaps an impulse to destroy. There are two types of nihilism, passive and active. Passive nihilism sees nihility as an end in itself, whereas active nihilism attempts to surpass it. We can very easily see the differences between these two with our two partners in crime, Kayron and Vildred respectively. This is why I believe Vildred finally hatched the plan of allowing the Archdemon to destroy everything. With Diche gone, the Archdemon would not be necessary anymore, and thus Orbis would have been saved. It actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it from his perspective. Nihilism comes from the root word nihil, which means nothing, and can be found in other words like annihilate, which means to bring to nothing. It comes from other philosophies like nominalism, skepticism, and philosophical pessimism. Pretty much, it's a belief system that says that nothing really matters. Things happen because they just happen. There is no grand plan. It can be traced back as far as the Buddha, around 550 BC, which makes sense as Buddhism is all about finding individual enlightenment by achieving something called nirvana, a place of nothingness, non-possession, or non-attachment. It's the complete release from the self, which Buddha described as the cause of all suffering. Whenever a person experiences suffering, it is because they are forced to change a part of their self. So, by ultimately letting go of their self and achieving nirvana, they would be also purged of all suffering. They would achieve enlightenment. Later on, nihilism would resurface in response to the spread of mainstream religions in the 1700s and 1800s. And then, furthermore, would be used by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche to describe the modern age where people are no longer constrained by religious values and are instead free to build their own meaning. However, this can also create a sense of purposelessness in a population, especially one where religion is prevalent. In Epic 7, Britannia houses a mainstay religion represented by the Church of the Goddess, where people were taught that the goddess and her heir of the Covenant were benevolent entities that protected them in times of crisis. Vildred, undoubtedly having encountered the church, would have begun to doubt the tenets of the faith and move philosophically in the opposite direction, towards non-purpose, towards nihilism. There is no glorious purpose. Perhaps the goddess and her heir of the Covenant were secretly antagonistic towards the people of Orbis, or simply using them like fodder all along, as Kayron would suggest. Kind of like when we sacrifice our crystal dogs to upgrade our heroes. And yes, I'm quite aware that the grand story entity Nihilum, to which I pronounce incorrectly in my Genesis of Epic 7 video, which you should definitely check out, sounds very much like nihilism. So perhaps there is a connection there as well. Anyhow, I digress. Vildred's Moonlight title, Arbiter, means one with the power to decide, which is his way of not being overwhelmed by the passive nihilistic tendencies that Kayron had adopted. Vildred recognizes that there is a certain meaninglessness to their struggle because, from his perspective, Ras and Dice are just using all of the people of Orbis as fodder to protect the actual planet itself. And for those following the grand story of Epic 7, they are protecting Prima's fragment. And to be fair, this is probably true, which is strange because Dice is a goddess of life. You would think that she would care about the lives she created a little bit more. Another reason for Ras and Dice's seemingly nonchalant attitude towards using people is that Ras may have been incredibly empathetic during the First World, but after the destruction of 6 worlds and countless battles against the Archdemon, that he may have inevitably become numb to the thoughts and feelings of the people. They had inevitably become a means to an end. With Dice's power fading, memories of past worlds were already beginning to seep into the people. This sadly would eventually cause someone to experience nihilistic tendencies, so perhaps it was only a matter of time before someone would seek after this truth. I think Charon got impatient and decided to take things into his own hands, him wanting to cease his existence and all. Also, I think Charon is lying to Vildred regarding the Archdemon leaving Orbis alone should Dice and Ras disappear, because we now know that Phastos was controlling Illyrios from the shadows to find Prima's fragment. I think it is more likely that Illyrios would have destroyed the planet under Phastos' orders, like how Straze did with Rekos, in an attempt to find the fragment. So Charon was straight up lying to Vildred, I think at least. The greatest irony here is that by doing what Charon did, we can undoubtedly credit Charon for saving Orbis. Yeah, just think about that for a second. Charon is our true savior. Light ML Charon, anyone? Yeah? Now, I'm going to argue that Vildred is more of an anti-hero than a fully fledged antagonist. The reason is because he chose a more beneficial and productive version of nihilism, active nihilism, whereas Charon does not really have any desire to overcome anything. Vildred recognizes the meaninglessness of his situation, but instead of falling prey and losing all hope, Vildred uses this information to motivate himself, to finding a solution. He actively struggles against his own nihilistic tendencies in order to do exactly what he said he would do during the prologue of the 6th world: defend this world of his. And that does it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video covering Vildred, and I hope that it has provided you with a little bit more context as to why he did what he did. And maybe, just maybe, I was able to convince you that Vildred's character arc through nihilism might actually be more engaging and interesting than Ras trying to understand humans. So, what do you think about all of this? If you enjoyed this kind of more psychological content, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on the little bell to be notified whenever I post another video. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, keep it real.